The ancient port city of Ostia Antica, located 25 kilometers southwest of Rome, was a city of paramount importance as goods, such as the necessary grain from Egypt headed to Rome, were offloaded by ships at Ostia. Its commercial importance in ancient Rome led to its development as a thriving city with a population of more than 100,000 inhabitants, with the infrastructure to match. Today, it is the best preserved and most complete ancient Roman city, with only Herculaneum being able to match it in terms of the extent of the preservation of buildings, or Pompeii if we are talking about preservation of particular mansions and frescoes. Today, we will take an in-depth tour of its many highlights. Like all major Roman cities, there was a necropolis, a series of above-ground, small houses for the dead, as the law mandated that the dead be buried outside the city. These houses for the dead, sometimes lavishly decorated, flank the roads leading to the city gates over a long distance. This one we will enter, for example, was built for a family. When members of the same household died, their ashes would have been put into these concave crypts. Walking past the city gates and into Ostia itself, we are flanked by what once were the street-side facades of Republican-era shops and restaurants and a commercial district. Save for some marble inscription pieces and foundations, not much remains of the arched gate into the city. Behind the shops were bathhouses, warehouses, and dwellings. Warehouses would have been a common theme in Ostia, as goods and shipping being the primary role of the city's existence. Ostia may have been Rome's first settlement or colony. Legend says the fourth king of Rome, Ancus Marcius, was the first to destroy Fincana, an ancient town 17 kilometers from Rome, which had a small harbour on the Tiber River. Ostia developed as a naval base and for other military purposes, most famously as the headquarters for the fleet of the First Punic War against Carthage. It soon became one of the most important commercial hubs, with every ship arriving from the known world offloading their goods into Rome at Ostia. Over the later Republic and Imperial centuries, it grew to a peak population of almost 100,000 inhabitants, leading to all the amenities needed for a large Roman town, such as apartment blocks, enormous baths and temples, and a theatre. Ostia is like a time capsule, abandoned after the decline of Western Rome after the 5th century AD. The deterioration of the harbour due to the creeping shoreline left unmaintained, combined with the marshy conditions and flooding, slowly led to its natural burial by soil. Here is a photo showing the flooding of the site in 1938, well after excavations had begun. As a result, the archaeological park is very similar to Pompeii, except it's only a half-hour train ride from Rome instead of a 3-hour train ride, while being more well preserved. It can be said that the popularity of Pompeii is due to the romantically tragic ending it faced by the hands of a volcano, whereas Ostia simply fell into decay over the centuries. The reality is, Ostia is like having Pompeii all to yourself, as the footage you see here is from the busiest tourist season in Rome of July, and apart from a few tour groups spread sporadically throughout the ancient city, you'll barely see anyone. The cobbled streets we are walking on are the original roads, still laden with hoof and wheel track marks. Our first stop is the Baths of Neptune, a bath complex covering 4,400 square meters, complete with separate men's and women's baths and a gym. Built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian and formally dedicated in early 139 AD by Emperor Antonius Pius, it continued to be renovated up until the 4th century AD. The complex is surrounded on all four sides by streets, with entrances on each street. The highlight here is the mosaics of Neptune riding a chariot surrounded by marine animals in the entrance of the men's baths just south of the Frigidarium cold bathroom. The central open area was surrounded on three sides by marble columns and had a reservoir in the center that collected water from the Julio-Claudian aqueduct and fed the bathhouses in the area. The Baths of Neptune are one of the few in Ostia that contains such open area. As we're walking, to the left of the baths are a series of shops, behind which was one of the numerous warehouses of Ostia. To the right was the monumental facade of the Baths of Neptune, built in the Hadrianic period. Up ahead is the Theatre of Ostia, built under the reign of Augustus at the end of the 1st century BC, with a capacity to hold 2,500 people and was enlarged to hold 4,000 by the end of the 2nd century. In the semicircular facade were 16 shops with back rooms behind a portico and entered through arches seen here. The lower level of the seating area can be entered through the central corridor as we're about to go through, or through two side entrances. Here we are in the vault of the main central entrance, which was covered in marble stucco, and as we see there are a few fragments still present which prevailed against looters over the centuries after Ostia fell into decline. The remaining stucco relief depicts Victoria crowning Hercules, who is actually Commodus, who associated himself with Hercules, and who was well known for his vanity and patron of theatrics and the games, the attempted deification of himself before his death, and trying to rename Rome in his own name. Commodus actually initiated the expansion of the theatre in AD 196, and we know this through brick stamps. An ancient text most likely refers to the Ostian theatre, with Emperor Septimius Severus stating to the Senate, quote, that it was disgraceful for Commodus to slay the wild beasts with his own hand, yet as Ostia only the other day, one of your own number, an old man who had been consul, was publicly sporting with a prostitute who imitated a leopard, unquote. This was in reference to the inauguration of the newly expanded theatre in 196 AD, the initiative started by Commodus and finished by Septimius Severus and Caracalla. It is estimated that later in the 5th or 6th century, when the Goths and other invaders harassed Ostia, the arches of the first level were blocked or walled in so that the building could be used as a fortress. Today the theatre is still used for performances, as we can see with the chairs set up. The back wall, which rose to a height of the back rows of the seating, has almost completely disappeared, save for some columns and stones. Parts of the facade and the seating area were restored and reconstructed after the excavations. If we walk to the side of the theatre, there is currently a room that displays all the remaining marble reliefs found which had once decorated the Ostian theatre, and you can imagine what the theatre once looked like if it was covered in marble. Opposite this room of marble remains and across this street is what used to be an apartment building, now called the House of the Infant Hercules, dated to the reign of Hadrian, for the wall paintings of the infant Hercules found inside. Moving on, behind the theatre is the Square of Corporations, which is one of the most famous monuments in Ostia, named after the corporations and guilds which are shown on its floor mosaics, which are advertisements for the shops and businesses behind the mosaics. The mosaics are associated with the later enlargement of the theatre, so the purpose of the area beforehand is speculated to have been a strolling area for theatre audiences. In the center of the square are the remains of a temple erected during the reign of Domitian, possibly assigned to the imperial Annona, a deity and the personification of the food and grain supply to the city of Rome and closely connected to Ceres, but it is not certain. Here is a photo of the temple before restoration. From this angle we are looking at the remains of the staircase. Let's have a look at some examples of these mosaics and how they advertised the businesses and offices behind them. The first well-preserved mosaic was in front of a business which, by the inscription Naviculariorum Lignariorum and the preserved upper part of a lighthouse with two ships, indicated this was the office of the wood shippers, and it was a special sort of wood, unlike firewood, that was used for building and repairing ships. The next well-preserved mosaic of a male figure with a grain measure and shovel means it was a business that traded in grain. Here is another mosaic which indicated the trade of grain, as Ostia received a bulk of its commercial business transporting the grain it received from Egypt and other parts of the empire to the capital of Rome. Next is a mosaic of two dolphins, indicating some sort of maritime trade or business. The inscription was never put onto the mosaic, so we can only speculate. Next to it is a mosaic of two fish, two ships, and a military tower. The meaning behind the mosaic is that two fish joined together and moving in opposite directions form the astrological sign Pisces. The myth goes that Venus and Cupid, who had to escape from the monster of storms, Typhon, transformed into fish, joined together by a rope, and moved in opposite directions. This station was used by shippers from Missoua on the north coast of Tunisia to import salted fish and the widely used garum, or fish sauce. The military tower might be in reference to the auxiliary grain fleet of Commodus, which, when needed, called upon Missoula's fleet to transport grain instead of fish products. Next is the child god Palamon, guardian of ships, riding a dolphin, flanked by another two dolphins. Above are two female heads, the personifications of winter and summer, with summer having grain ears. This likely alludes to the business supplying olives, which are harvested in autumn and winter, and grain, which is harvested in summer. The next shop is missing half of the inscription at the bottom, but the business most likely imported marble from the area of northwest Tunisia, then Roman Carthage. Next, there is an elephant under the inscription indicating that from the harbour at Ostia, wild animals were exported to the arena in Rome. While the elephant can also indicate ivory, such expensive luxury items are out of place at this square. The people of Ostia were very familiar with these animals because they were kept at a zoo south of Ostia, where elephant bones have been found. Next office was used by shippers and merchants, as indicated by the inscription and mosaic of a cargo ship, using the space to advertise their services. Another grain shipping office, used by shippers from Gumi at Roman Carthage. The mosaics are of a grain measure, flanked by two grain ears. Another office, used by shippers from Carthage, with two ships and fish below the text.
That is very interesting because they were mortal enemies.
Next is an office used by shippers from what is now the northwest part of Sardinia. Another office used by shippers and merchants from what is now the south coast of Sardinia, modern-day Cagliari. This station was used by the sack bearers, as the mosaics show men transporting sacks of goods from the larger ships to smaller ships, which would then dock in the harbour. This office is where you would hire these labourers. These people were united in a guild and formed a vital link in the food supply of Rome, carrying all sorts of goods, not necessarily using sacks only. The mosaics show a man carrying an amphora, probably filled with fish sauce or olive oil. The north side Portuguese, which we are facing now, was once where the Tiber River flowed, until a massive geological event which shifted it further north to where it flows today. We can see the difference here. Next are a few unidentifiable commercial spaces. Here we see a lighthouse. Next is an office depicting a river delta with three mouths, which is either the Tiber or more likely the Nile, providing the import of grain and wild animals. Next is an office with mosaics of animals, including an elephant, most likely involved in the wild animals trade. Here is a mosaic showing the business is in the trade of shipping amphora bottles. These bottles, filled with fish sauce, olive oil, or other liquids, had pointed ends for transporting on ships. The ship decks were filled with sand, and the bottles were laid next to each other. This is the shrine of the altar of the twins, Romulus and Remus, at a little shrine southwest of the Corporation Square. The original is now at the National Museum of Rome, and what we see here is a plaster cast replica. At some point this room was ransacked, however the shrine was covered by a large piece of ceiling. Behind the shrine was a residence called the House of Apuleius, built in the Republican period, then rebuilt in a Pompeian plan after AD 148. Emerging back on the main street and opposite the theatre side of the street are the remains of a row of shops, which were the ground level shops of apartment buildings. Next, on the street west of the theatre, and what we're facing, is the 4 small temples, built on one large podium. 4 wooden temples had existed here from the early 2nd century BC, and the remains we see today are from the 1st century BC and restorations from the 2nd century AD, and they were dedicated to Venus, Fortuna, Ceres, and Spes. On the opposite side of the street is the temple of the deified emperor Pertinax. The masonry of the temple has been dated to the reign of Commodus, and it was installed on top of an older Hadrianic complex. As we can see from the remaining fragments of the dedicatory inscription, displayed outside and opposite the temple, it was set up by the Guild of the Builders in Ostia. We can still see from this angle the podium and stairs as well as the altar outside. This is a cross-section drawing of the reconstruction of the temple for comparison. Walking on the main central street in Ostia, we are flanked on both sides by what remains of a Hadrianic period commercial complex consisting of shops, workshops, and storage areas. On the main street again, we are flanked on both sides by ruins of four-story high apartment buildings which constituted Roman public housing. Behind our right-hand side apartment was the Grand Warehouse, the largest commercial building in Ostia. Seen in this image, from this angle we are walking on the second block left from the theatre. Here we can see the apartment complex, which is to our right when we were walking away from the theatre, and the Grand Warehouse behind it. We are walking past more apartment buildings and the remains of commercial spaces such as shops on the ground level. We get a good peek on the left street of a well-preserved insula that we will soon talk about. Next to our right is the Grand Warehouse, built during the reign of Claudius, one of the most important and largest complexes in all of Ostia. Its poor state of preservation stands in sharp contrast as one of the most important buildings. This is where grain was stored and could hold enough for 15,000 people for a year, consisting of a central area of storerooms surrounded by four wings of storerooms. Seen in this reconstructed drawing here, the raised floors help protect the food from damp conditions and rodents. Compared to the rest of the famous monuments in Ostia, not much remains except for foundational walls and stones and pieces of columns. It was a publicly owned warehouse with a grand presence, being able to hold nearly 7 metric tons of grain. Opposite this warehouse is the House of the Millstones, first constructed during the 2nd century AD Hadrianic period, which only consisted of shops, and the Severan period, a large barrel-vaulted roof was installed to facilitate milling. Entering these rooms, we can still find the stone mills. Another interesting building is the Ostia Synagogue. This and another synagogue located on the far side of Ostia near the seashore are not only some of the oldest synagogues in the world, but the oldest synagogues in Europe and the oldest one uncovered outside of Israel. Built during the reign of Claudius in the mid-1st century AD, it continued to be used up until the 5th century. One of two remaining structural marble pieces jutting out from the wall depicts the 7-armed candle menorah, accompanied by a ram's horn and a bundle of 3 species of plants which were important symbols of Judaism that allude to the worship at the temple in Jerusalem and expresses the hope that it will be rebuilt after the destruction of the temple in the later 1st century AD. Inside was the ark, in which scrolls of the Torah were held. Right next to the synagogue was the House of the Dolia, constructed in the Severan period and was used for storing wine or olive oil in cool temperatures in buried jars, an ancient method of refrigeration. Ostia was the only place in ancient Rome other than the city of Rome to have apartment buildings, and the street we are walking on now was full of them. To our right were buildings with rows of shops on the ground level and apartments on the top levels, and to our left were two apartment complexes known as the House of the Paintings and House of the Infant Bacchus. Both were Hadrianic era buildings and were the first apartments to be discovered in Ostia, receiving its names from the remains of paintings on its walls, though they rapidly deteriorated after excavation. Peeking through, we can see a preserved section of mosaics on the wall. Apartment buildings in Ostia could be built up to 6 stories high. However, the law mandated that 4 stories was the limit after the Great Fire of Rome during the reign of Nero in AD 64. In front of these two apartments, standing in the street corner, is the House of Jupiter and Ganymede. All apartment buildings we have looked at so far were called insula and represent public housing from the imperial era. The insula of Jupiter at the back overlooked a courtyard garden, and some rooms were decorated with frescoes including the birth of Venus, Jupiter, and Ganymede. Here is a reconstruction of the insula from the front, and this is a plan of the 3 insula we have covered, with the pink representing the insula of Jupiter and Ganymede, with the clear area behind it being the garden. This image shows a reconstruction of the garden behind the insula, and here is the garden today, with a little shrine with the statue of Jupiter remaining. Opposite the insula is one of the more famous buildings in Ostia, representing the average day-to-day life of an ancient Roman, which is seldom appreciated amongst the vast ruins of forums, temples, basilicas, and palaces of Rome. Dubbed the House of the Wine Bar, built in the Trajannic to Hadrianic period, you can really get a good sense of what it was like on the ground, living the average day-to-day life, coming in here to get something to eat or drink. The vaulted ceilings are well preserved, and there are paintings preserved behind glass on the wall and a marble counter, which had 2 sides, one to serve people on the street and one to serve people inside, with the floor mosaics, as well as some inside the bar still preserved, and a wine jug is on the marble counter. We can stand behind the remarkably well-preserved marble counter and feel what it was like to be a business worker in ancient times serving wine and food. There is a basin under the counter to place or wash bowls and dishes. Walking outside, we are flanked on both sides by apartments, with shops and businesses on the ground floor. Up ahead in the corner is perhaps the most famous apartment in Ostia, the House of Diana. once a 4-story apartment building, the incredibly well-preserved remaining 2 floors gives us a good idea of the scale of public housing in Imperial Rome. Here is a reconstruction of the insula, comparing the ruins of today to the reconstruction of the insula during the Antonine period. Apartments such as these had the most expensive rooms at the lowest level, where one didn't need to climb up and down the stairs, carrying heavy loads and water, and most importantly, providing easy escape in case of fire. The upper stories were usually occupied by the lower class. Though Rome at its peak had more than 1 million inhabitants, we must venture outside to Ostia to get a better look at more well-preserved public housing buildings to get a sense of what the majority of people went through, not just the upper-class patricians. The only surviving insula in Rome is at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, the Insula dell'Araceli, discovered when Benito Mussolini initiated his project of removing the areas of ancient imperial forums in the Capitoline Hill district of any later medieval additions, and has 4 surviving floors. We can see down to the ground level, where there was 400 square meters of shops facing the surrounding streets, with the remaining floors for apartments of various sizes. Opposite the House of Diana is now called the Square of the Lares, receiving its name from a round marble altar. Dating back to the reign of Augustus or Claudius, lares, or spirits believed to protect the household and crossroads, are led to the altar by Paeans, followers of Dionysus, while Hercules stands nearby. The altar was dedicated by the religious officials or magistrates to the lares of the neighborhood. In front of the altar was a water basin. However, its usage, whether religious or simply practical, is unknown. This is a floor plan of the small complex, where the circular shrine led the spirits inside the rectangular rooms full of shrines. Our last major stop for this video is the main Forum of Ostia, where we can see the Hadrianic Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, one of the ruins of Ostia which has always been visible after its decline, with records of the removal of marble from its walls dating to the 15th century. Here is a depiction of the temple in 1810 before excavations, and this is what it would have looked like during the Middle Ages, so any valuable material on the temple above the ground level, such as marble, would have already been taken. However, today, we still have the walls, podium, stairs, and pieces of columns to easily imagine the original grandeur of the main temple of Ostia. We have the altar with sections of marble friezes remaining pieced together. The staircase was, however, reconstructed using the original materials found during excavations, and here is a photo of it before the restoration. On the opposite side of the street was the older section of the Forum, and at the end of the open space was a temple built by Emperor Tiberius dedicated to Roma and Augustus. And to the left from our view was the Forum Baths. And to the right was the Ostian Basilica, dated to the 1st century AD. here we have some remains of the marble decoration of the basilica, and here we have some remains of marble decorations of the Temple of Augustus and Roma. As we exit Ostia, ending this short tour, we are walking on the shoreline of where the ancient Tiber River flowed. As we can see the theatre again, with the square of corporations, it makes it much easier to disembark or offload cargo and goods from your boat to the shops and businesses in the square. Now we are walking past the remains of the barracks of the fire brigade, and in the center was a temple and shrine for the imperial cult. Up ahead is the ruins of the baths of the Coachmen, which was right next to the Porta Romana, the gate into the city. Built in the early reign of Hadrian, the name reflects the beautiful mosaic of coaches found in the baths. It is speculated that the Guild of the Coachmen owned these baths, but it is not certain. Not everyone had a horse, and coaches and wagons were akin to the taxis of today. Taking a bath here, just after entering the city gates, would be tempting after a long dusty trip on the road from Rome to Ostia. Past these baths are the ruins of houses. For more filmed on-site content on ancient history, please leave a like and subscribe.